All right, we are back with our first returning guest, Sara Holoubek. How's it going, Sara? Thanks so much for returning.
Thank you, Brian.
And I'm actually excited. So, Sara, you got new headphones, or you aren't using headphones now, so we're going to get a little bit of New York City vibes in the podcast for the first time.
Wild and crazy.
So let's kick off. So the reason I asked you back, because I know Sara's the CEO of Luminary Labs, who publishes a lab report, which is their publishing that has whatever they're thinking about, which is usually way forward thinking. And one of the topics that's come up in the lab report quite often is voice tech. And it's kind of an interesting subject because I was surprised in doing the research. I found out Alexa was first launched in 2014, which was 5 years ago. And the cycle from where we are now from when it started happened in 5 years, which is kind of crazy to think about. So I wanted to kick off. When did voice tech first pop on your radar? Kind of how did that come to be?
Well, as I might have shared before, my previous career was in the digital space, early internet, Internet 1.0, as we would say. And at one point, I jumped into the search marketing industry, and this was before Google was public. And it occurred to me at one point that typing in a keyword is a very archaic way to find what you need. And there has to be an easier way. And as Google entered into video and audio, this idea of voice or any type of audio content becoming not just the output, but the input became more and more apparent. I think from a more professional perspective and seeing concrete programs, advances in natural language processing over the past 5 to 10 years would come to bear as we think about big data and especially in healthcare, how do you get your arms around all these things, we start to see the beginnings of voice tech because it really all comes down to language. But making that jump between language and voice really didn't come about until the Amazon Alexa became the default holiday gift. I don't know if you remember it. It was probably 2016 or 2017, depending on who you are. But I always describe that holiday season as the year every uncle got their niece or nephew a dot, right? Like I know my uncle handed them out to all the kids. We all got dots that year. And if you look at the penetration of those devices, and specifically the Amazon Alexa Echo device, there was this huge hockey stick. Now, obviously, we all had been using Siri or Cortana to some extent prior, but this virtual assistant or the smart speaker, however you want to call it, being installed in homes across the country was really this tipping point where I think for enterprise, voice became a very real thing. You couldn't say no when you go home and use Siri or use Alexa to manage your playlist or find a recipe.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that. So I do the exact same thing. I kind of start in my own personal life, and I'm a tech geek, and I was front and center in delivering Alexa to my family, so I can definitely relate to that.
You were that uncle.
I was, yeah. And I think my entire family used it, asked about the weather, and then we're like, this is interesting, and I think it's collected dust ever since. So I'm not sure. So the adoption curve went way up. When you start to see something tip or something that has potential, both personally and professionally, how do you start processing that? Do you look at the opportunities, the risks? Do you kind of look at it all encompassing, or do you focus on one particular piece of it at first?
Well, I think the word or phrase emerging technology it's a really big bucket. And oftentimes we think of voice as the thing, the dot, or it's your iPhone and Siri inside, but it's really a combination of a couple of things. So voice today, as we understand it, is some type of device that has some type of language capability. It has conversational design. and it has apps or skills that allow you to do specific things that other organizations are typically developing. And then underneath it all, it has artificial intelligence and other technologies that only get better as we use the system more. So, you think about, if you're going to start a voice project, um, the voice app or skill is only as good as the training data. And so when you're sitting on top of Alexa, like suddenly you have like lots of data, lots of ability there. Um, but where do you start, right? So I think first off, I think about what that thing is. And I don't really think about voice as a single technology, as I mentioned, but it's really the confluence of these different things. It's the Internet of Things, that device, there's artificial intelligence, there's machine learning continuously over time, there's the conversational interface. And I think that's where I think the world is going, that I think of voice more like a mouse. It's like a new way of navigating information of any kind. It crosses industry. It's like the introduction of a touch screen. Dramatically changed how we interact with all things digital. We use it to consume and we use it to create, right? So when you think about that, do you remember the first touch screen that you had in your hands and you're like, whoa, this idea of pinching and pulling and, suddenly you could break free of your mouse, but not always. You probably still have a mouse or a trackpad. You might have a screen somewhere. And I think voice is one of these new ways of navigating the world. So I think of voice as more than a thing. Whereas I would say an emerging technology such as like VR, it's not dissimilar. There's like a headset, there's hardware, and then there's software, right? And there might be an underlying operating system. But that's a little bit more narrow. I don't know if we're all going to end up living in VR, but we might all end up using voice instead of a keyboard, especially for applications where it just makes more sense, where it's faster, it's more accurate, where, one of the best applications is usually any career or task where it's dangerous to be typing, like driving, for example. Terrible idea to drive and type. I mean, it's a great idea to talk and drive.
Yes, absolutely. I think distracted driving is that. I had a note down for that because that's, I think, the optimal use case for voice tech right now. And hopefully, I think it's coming into some cars here and there, but probably not as much as it should. But let's talk enterprise for a second because I know you interact with a wide variety of clients. Where do you see voice tech at in that regard at this day, present day?
Well, our first engagement in voice was designing and producing the Alexa Diabetes Challenge on behalf of Merck of Kenilworth in New Jersey, pharmaceutical, and in partnership with Amazon. So I would say the health sector, not traditionally known as the mover and shaker with emerging technology, is actually much further ahead with voice than many other sectors. And I know that might come to a surprise, but having participated in a number of conferences since running this program, people will talk to me about how great it is that they're using voice for advertising. And then when we tell them that, there are people looking at disease management, clinical operations, like, reduction of time and cost for physicians, any number of applications, even including things like understanding vocal biomarkers, they just look at me like I come from another planet. They're like, whoa, I had no idea. So health is actually much further ahead than many other sectors. If we want to deep dive into some of those areas, I think.
Well, Sarah, real quick, why do you think that is? Because I know pretty much across the board, healthcare is at least maybe 5 years behind in a lot of areas of technology. So why has voice been one that's we've gotten out in front of?
Well, I think that the one of the primary reasons is that the earliest adopters of voice in health were hospitals. They are accustomed to recording. So if you think of like physicians recording doctor's notes or that's part of the job is to type things in and it saves time. I heard a stat from somebody at a conference last year that using a voice system or a smart assistant saves like 2 hours for a doctor, which is a lot of time. So I think that there are many processes that are already in the workflow where voice just it makes sense. It saves time, and we all know that healthcare systems would like more time back, right? Like,
Yeah, and probably more use of their hands,
more
because
use for
especially
your hands. Yeah,
doctors.
exactly. More use for your hands, saving time, accuracy. And doctors use voice recordings for lots of different reasons, right? Like it's a profession where that's a common thing, whether you're making a note to yourself or recording something. So I think that that's part of it. And so I think the hospitals like Boston Children's, John Brownstein was one of the very earliest adopters, and most recently is one of the first skills under the HIPAA compliant Alexa banner, I guess, pushing the envelope very early. They had run a hackathon the fall before we produced the challenge. And so they were really one of our reference points. So I think that it's one of those situations where it was out of necessity and out of the sheer benefit, right? So if you look at the cost benefit analysis, whereas if you say VR, there aren't a lot of experiences that translate. It's introducing something new, whereas voice is adding to something that already exists.
You're supplementing a manual process, because in my experiences, which I haven't seen a ton of doctors, their typing skills aren't always the best, because they focus on practicing medicine, which makes sense.
Right.
But everyone knows how to talk. I
Yes.
guess it's good we've made it 11 minutes in without being doomsday, but here comes some of it. So I think the biggest concern is privacy, because obviously almost all these platforms operate in some sort of cloud feature or function where your voice goes to the cloud, is processed, and comes back. And definitely for healthcare, but really broader than healthcare, I think privacy is always at the top of the list, especially since the device typically has to be listening in 100% of the time for the keyword. So how do you think about privacy in terms of voice tech?
So I think it's actually not dissimilar from things that came in the past. So one of the things that we talk about is that think about voice as making things conversational, and it's one of many waves of digital disruption, and it gives us an opportunity to rethink everything. So when the web arrived, we needed to make things that were brick and mortars virtual. It was very hard. I remember working on like the Bloomingdale's account, and the question was, how do we translate that wonderful experience of working or shopping in a retail environment and make that virtual? Like, can you actually put that online? And there were questions about whether it was even possible. And today, I think, e-commerce is huge, right? Like, think about how many things we don't shop for anymore. So we had to rethink everything. We had to rethink the experience. We had to rethink the product selection. It was more than just a channel. It became the store. When search arrived, things had to become discoverable. So you had to go back and say, well, that website's beautiful, but you can't find anything. So we had to absolutely rethink the actual words that real people use. That's when I remember working on a project where it was an electronics retailer realized that they could sell a lot more VCRs, if you remember those things, if they used a different term than VCR, right? So some people would say video player, some people would say VCR, tape player, people would use. So if you start to think about that long tail. When search moved on to social, everything had to be shareable. So it didn't just have to be findable, but then you had to be comfortable that they might find it on other places. And when mobile came along, it had to become responsive, right? So there was a time where I remember optimizing a website for like 20 different types of phones, different screen sizes. And today we have responsive websites, right? And voice means that we had to make it conversational. So we have to rethink everything. So, okay, so where does privacy come into this? So we do have to rethink everything, absolutely everything. Not just the experience superficially, but the experience deeply. Search has a lot of privacy concerns as well, right? Google knows far more about you than anybody has ever known about you, including maybe yourself. And so will voice. So I don't think they're different. I think we've gotten over these new digital waves, but we have to be conscious about how we design these. So I read just recently that you can now delete your Alexa record if you like, right? I think there's a lot around commands and whether you're calling on the device or not. Like everybody has that experience where like Siri goes off and you didn't invoke Siri and you say, whoa, what is going
That's weird.
on?
Yeah.
There was this edge case where a woman's phone conversations were sent to somebody. So we are nowhere near where we need to be, but also remember the early days of search. We used to actually publish, Yahoo used to publish the exact search terms and the exact quantity. You know, today Google has this index and it's weighted, but we used to know exactly how many people looked for like a person's name or a particular product. And AOL had a famous big data oops where they opened up a bunch of data and search queries and different pieces of information. They thought they had de-identified it, but there was enough metadata that you could quickly figure out whether it was your neighbor or not. So, I mean, we've been through this in the past. So I think we have to look back and know that what's old is new again. And so there's a lot of work to be done. So by no means is it perfect. By no means are we already there. I think what really needs to happen is that anybody engaging in any emerging technology, whether it's voice or any application of artificial intelligence, you really need to think about the unintended consequences and design the product or service with that in mind. What is the worst possible thing that could go wrong, and how are you going to hedge against it?
I'm going to come back to unintended consequences, but first, I guess where it is different for me is that in the past, all the adaptation and changes that had to happen, it happened across the entire internet. We may get to a place where there's tons of companies offering voice tech, but it seems like Amazon, Google, and some others that have massive amounts of resources, huge amounts of data, have been the ones that have been able to surface this technology first, and everything kind of runs through them. I think if you open any news article now, I mean, the data privacy and kind of nervousness around the amount of data and what those companies have the power to do makes everyone at least a little bit nervous. And there's calls for reform and breaking up the different companies. So, I mean, that's where one area where I think it's a little bit different, that everything runs through these 4 big companies and you kind of have to put your trust in them to use the technology. That's how I'm thinking about it. And do you feel the same or similar?
Yeah, I would say a yes and. So, the concept that there are just a few of them makes people very nervous. If you look at the American economy at large, it is actually less competitive. It's hard to compete when you have that many really big companies with a lot of money. So that's actually not good for our competitiveness overall. And there are a lot of other concerns that come with that. What I think is really at play here is that these are the companies that are natural entrants to voice because they have either search data, purchase data, or search query data. They have language, and that does make sense. It's not. I think it's not something new. What I think is new is our relationship with privacy. So I was just having this conversation yesterday with somebody. Your credit card company knows a lot about you. They know how much debt you have. They know how much you spend. They know, that Snickers are your guilty pleasure, right? Like what they know every level of information. They know where you go. And yet we don't have a lot of concern about the credit card company knowing this. They sell your data. Like we know this, right? Mail order catalogs sell your data. Like we might be annoyed by it, but we accept it to be part of that transaction. And I think initially in the first 10 to 15 years of the internet, this premise that we wouldn't be shoved marketing, that it would be pulled by us based on who we are, and the more a system knew about us was appealing, right? Like if I could get exactly what I wanted by searching, that's a lot better than somebody putting a lot of bad, catalogs in my mailbox.
Or searching an encyclopedia.
Or searching an encyclopedia, right? The cost benefit analysis in one's mind was great. And I was one of those people. I was like, okay, I'm willing to give up that information. I think until more recently, when we start to understand the extent to which this data is being used for purposes outside of, our benefit. So a credit card company is most likely using your data for other commercial purposes of purchasing, right? So like you purchase a lot of this, you might want to purchase that, right? Uh, that makes sense. But using my search data to then push misinformation to me, or using my online purchase data to refine ads that aren't really related to purchases, becomes concerning. And
Or if they know you're a Democrat and surface a lot of
yes,
Republican. I mean, that's
right.
some of that seems to be happening,
No,
and
it
it's
is
causing.
happening. I mean, the Cambridge
Mhm.
Analytica affair was,
Mhm.
a lot of people erroneously think that this was a data leak. It wasn't. Facebook was designed to do this. All of these platforms were designed to share certain sets of data. It wasn't like anybody could use the same data. There were special, agreements between different companies. And I think once the public realized this, uh, our relationship with privacy changed a lot, right? And I think we're in a very awkward middle ground right now. We do not have the level of regulation that other industries like health or like the financial services industry have. You're not supposed to spam people. When is the last time you heard somebody get arrested for spamming? Right?
Yeah, not often.
Right? Right? There are all sorts of things that if you think about informed consent, that's a really big one for health and for voice and emerging technology overall. Terms and conditions are the new informed consent. You don't read those terms and conditions, right? Nobody does. I read something that like it would take you like days to read all of the terms and conditions that you have agreed to, and I think it was like something like 7 or 9 hours just to read Amazon's.
Yeah, I actually had a social informatics class in college when Facebook was first coming into being what Facebook is now, and I that was my project. I dug into the terms of service and basically surfaced, hey, Facebook owns everything you give it, and I got blank stares when I gave the report. No one seemed to care, and that I don't think it's changed in 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, about a year and change ago, I wrote a piece for MMM, which is in the healthcare space, and it's magazine. And I wrote this piece called "The Rise of the Health Tech Ethicist," mostly because of what I was seeing around digital biomarkers and using the major platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Google, et cetera, to understand things about our health, which sounds really exciting. Like, wow, we might be able to find people who are appropriate for a clinical trial. It would save money. Those people would be able to find the right trials. But have they consented to being tapped on the shoulder? Do you want to be diagnosed based on how you search? And so I interviewed a number of people, and the piece was published in March of last year. And 2 days later, the Cambridge Analytica affair was revealed. It was a Friday night, if you recall. And the next morning or afternoon or so, there was the news that the first Uber death happened in Arizona. And so I wrote this short little piece that basically said, I don't think we're ready for the world we've programmed. We have absolutely not thought about the unintended consequences. And I know you're not supposed to read the comments, but I got a lot of hate comments and crazy sort of, you're supposed to be a technologist, Sarah. Like, how can you say this? And I decided after that experience that you could be both pro tech and pro ethics. They're not mutually exclusive. In fact, we're gonna have much better tech if we teach designers, developers, strategists, managers, CEOs, and boards of directors to develop an ethical imagination and to consider the role of ethics in the development of these products and services. And we have so many examples, like, and they're not all nefarious. Like, there was this case where Strava, which collects like Fitbit and other movement data, mostly for people who are runners or what have you. They thought it'd be really cool to like open up the data and you'd have this great data visualization of people using Strava all over the globe. So you'd see people's running paths. And they opened it up and like some teenager realized that the data surfaced a previously sort of hidden or secret military base. So not only does the world now know there's a military base there, they know exactly where the soldiers are walking or jogging. Massive security risk, right?
Yep.
Maybe like national security risk or international security risk. And so that was not like malicious in intent. It was just they could not have imagined that. And so when you think about privacy, if you're responsible for collecting some type of data and it's jogging data, you have to imagine who could be jogging. What's the worst possible thing that could happen if jogging data were made public? And they were probably thinking like it's all anonymous. You'd never be able to find an individual. There's just so many people that you couldn't figure out if it was a single person. And they hadn't come up with this idea of like that there might be parts of the earth that don't need to be revealed. So, so I think that was like a really good example in a learning. And I think they very quickly, they realized that mistake and apologized. Other organizations make really big mistakes and they don't apologize and they don't correct their ways. I think Facebook had a really hard time and still has a hard time. They're still figuring it out. But following that Cambridge Analytica report, they just said like this, they refused to talk. I think they didn't say anything for like at least a few days or a week. And when they did, it was as if they were living in a bubble where they didn't realize that they're playing with people's lives and countries and national and international politics. It was really it was astounding.
That's the hardest part, right? Is that the scale that these platforms are operating on are so massive that my next question was gonna be, do you think these tech companies are thinking of ethical and moral kind of considerations? And I'm sure the answer has to be yes. It's just a matter, can they do it on the scale that they need to?
There are some that are, and I think most of the major platforms have already made enough mistakes that they're bringing people on board. And you see this in health in particular. There's a Facebook health team, and Twitter has some health folks, and Google obviously has Verily, and you start to see these teams be built out. Amazon, absolutely, you've got Missy over there. So that's very heartening for me that they've recognized it, but it's a lot of work. And it's one thing to sort of have a team that's dedicated to an industry. It's another one to make sure that every part of your company has that ethical imagination. That's the hard part.
Absolutely. And with voice tech, the way I think about it too, it's a little bit different than how we approach things in healthcare. You may tell me I'm wrong, and feel free to. But I think about it in that normally we try to control. We ask really specific questions and try to get specific answers. Voice tech flips that completely, where it says, ask me whatever you want, and we'll figure out how to manage it.
Yeah, I think it depends on the application. I think the best applications right now in voice and health are really clinician use, like in hospital use.
So they are more targeted.
It's very targeted. Some of them are even using a closed environment, so they're not using, like an Echo or Siri. They might be using a modified system or a completely closed system that's proprietary to them. So for me, that's why that you have that adoption. Now that we have HIPAA compliance, it's going to open up the doors. I think the consumer applications still have a long way to go, and that's okay. A lot of people are still figuring out, what and how they should be working with voice. I always tell people, rather than trying to build the end all, just get your hands dirty and build a very simple skill. It's almost like the MVP, and it could be for anything. And pilot that before you decide to go big.
And using that approach, does that help mitigate the unintended consequences because you can control it so much more?
Well, I think you learn. It's sort of like imagine, the rapid increase in voice devices and voice conversational users, I should say, people who use conversation as their interface, is just such a hockey stick. If you compare it to even the internet, it's quite incredible. But imagine you were plopped down sometime after Internet 1.0, when the internet had more capabilities, and you were going to build your very first website. Would you build the end all? I did that in those days. It was very expensive, and most of it was outmoded in 6 months, right? Clients that would build these $5 million websites that today, you could build on WordPress for nothing. Um, so I think learn from the past and build something small to like learn the chops, like get the earn sort of the this is how this works. Build it small. It's like building anything that's big. You don't you want to be iterative and agile so that you can make mistakes and make and break. It's okay to make something that breaks and do it in a small closed environment, maybe even internally. Like I've heard of a number of organizations, like they try to build skills internally just to like see how it works before they try to do something with a business case.
I haven't worked with any sort of voice tech development or process design. Is it similar to some other technologies of the past, or is it completely different in how you even approach putting something like this together?
It's a really good question. So I think it's like, and I think it's not hard. It's not hard, but you do have to get your hands dirty. So the thing that I think is the hardest is understanding the move to conversational design. So design an experience based on like what somebody might ask you and what they will want to hear. So, I think in the earlier days of Siri and still sometimes today, like you ask Siri something and then she starts reading a web page to you and it's just awful. Right. And over time we start to have applications that are fun. Like one of the applications that like my son used is this one called Kids Court. So if your children are acting up, you can summon Judge Alexa, and they have to make their case, and there can be like somebody who then like the defendant, I guess, like defends him or herself, and then Alexa decides whether you're guilty or not, and then the punishment is usually like doing a silly dance in the living room, and it's so well designed. It is like it's designed for the way a child's brain works. It's you can teach the child that what they did was wrong without being too like intense about it, and they sort of understand this idea of justice, and it is interesting. I was like, it was so clever. Now, if this were done without understanding what makes kids laugh, or explaining the idea of a court system to a child in a way that they couldn't understand, it would have been a flop. So it's sort of like thinking about early mobile experiences. There were people who tried to just put their entire website on a cell phone, but that didn't work. You have to think about what the mobile experience is. So that's the hard part, is conversational design. Or, some people talk about multimodal experiences. We don't have people with that experience. It's early. It's so early that like there are very few people who are expert at that. I would say even the most advanced, voice tech people, they're still just piloting everything, sort of like we were piloting everything in early internet. So for me, that's harder than the technology, and that's why I oftentimes say that there will be like many bad voice apps, and there are like so many bad voice skills. It's okay that you have to get those out to practice and then continue to build.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think if you do any sort of design thinking, I think it seems like it follows kind of a similar approach to that, where you
Yeah.
need to have your use case really well defined, come at it from a business impact, rather than you can't take a technology first approach with this at all. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So when you're going about designing these, I know one of the things that I've seen a few articles pop up recently is that there's bias built into Alexa or built into some of these technologies because of the people that design it. And the one I most recently saw is that Alexa just doesn't work well with if you have a heavy Indian accent.
Mm-hmm.
So I know in my world there's been a huge push for diversity and inclusion, and I know you're a big advocate based on what I've seen in your social posts. So I guess how does diversity and inclusion come into this?
Yeah.
Do you think it's absolutely necessary to have so many different perspectives? Otherwise,
Well, yeah.
you're going to be missing.
Of course, I think I mean, one of the great things about these emerging technologies, I think artificial intelligence in particular, is that we're learning that um, your applications are only as good as the data that you put into it, right? So, like the whole garbage in, garbage out thing rings true. Um, one of our judges for the Alexa Diabetes Challenge, Ifoma Njuma, she had this great statement where she said, if your application ignores 10% of the population, that's bad. If that 10% belongs to the same group, they're all women, they're all people of color, they're all elderly, that's really bad. So I think that the public admissions of not necessarily wrongdoing, because I don't think people realize that they're doing this, but like, wow, we have to really rethink our training data or our data sets before we decide to use artificial intelligence to make decisions is a good thing. Amazon itself had this AI pilot where they were going to use some type of scanning, quick pulling out of resumes, like who are the best candidates, and the solution was designed to actually have bias, and so any use of the word women got penalized. So if you were like in the women's chess club, that would get penalized. So, and it was based off of biased data. So I love that that went public because it's a good warning signal so that we can learn not to do these types of things in the future or learn more about the training data. I think it's not that it's built in, it's that we don't know it's built in because we are the ones building this in. Like, data is just a reflection of our society, and our society is incredibly biased. So the harder question is, can technology be better than human beings? Right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah, and I think it's cool that this is an instance where you can see the results speak for themselves, right?
yeah,
And you can, I mean, we've all been a part of an awesome team that's super diverse and everyone thinks differently and it just works. And we've been a part of those teams where it's not everyone's diverse, but it doesn't work. And I think it's cool that it's kind of built into the equation that if you want to be successful in this area, you have to come with a broad perspective.
absolutely. And it's very important to us that any program that we design, whether we're doing research strategy or standing up an initiative or a new technology, that we build in that thinking at the onset. And I'm always surprised at how many people wait until something bad happens.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I think you'll see an increase of raised awareness. Ultimately, it's going to become a litigation risk, and health in particular is not a fan of that. So, it will be. I think it will become the default. I hope it doesn't become a let's not do that. It's too scary.
Yeah, I hope not either.
Yes.
That's interesting. You mentioned reactivity or reactiveness.
Mhm.
You mentioned regulators earlier in one of your points. I guess I've thought about it a lot. How do we get ahead of some of this stuff? Whether it's AI, voice tech, virtual reality, the system's not really built for that. I guess, kind of to your earlier point around Uber and that situation,
Mhm.
it's always seen the way I've seen regulation play out in researching is that the technology comes, we see something, and then we react to it, and usually the regulation comes maybe 2 or 3 years after the fact, and that's not always the case, but I think it's generally reactive. So, do you think it's critical that we try to make it more proactive? And is that a piece of this ultimate success for voice tech and other new emerging technologies?
It's a really good question. I think that,
I'm expecting you to have the
yeah,
total
I
answer.
mean, my big answer is you need to elect officials who understand technology because they're the ones who make the laws and legislation. So that's where
Yep.
we need to start. I know a number of people who've run for office who, are pointing out why our country needs elected officials that have this experience. Just like we want elected officials who've been doctors, we want elected officials who've been technologists. Like, this is important as they're creating the rules by which everyone will need to play. I think if you watched any of the hearings around Facebook, some of the questions were laughable. It was fairly clear that many senators didn't really understand how technology actually works. And not, I don't expect everyone to know the ins and outs. Not everyone's a techie, but how can you be making law if you do not understand how it how it works and what could go wrong? And so I would say start by like electing people who are techies. I don't care which party, just make sure they're technologists.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think if we could, if I think it's kind of a difficult ask too. As a congressman, I'm sure they work however many hours a week,
Mhm.
and it's hard. They don't have the easiest job of trying to govern the entire nation. So, but at the same time, it's critically important because otherwise we're going to run. Especially with AI. I mean, that's the scariest one because if that, I mean, you hear Elon Musk or some of the
Mhm.
really super forward-thinking people that can start really scaring you if they tell you kind of what is possible. It's a difficult question or kind of problem to solve. But I think coming back to your earlier point of companies taking the ownership of the ethical and moral considerations, and that has to be the start. And then I wonder if do you think there's any opportunity for either the tech world or some other sort of governing body outside of oversight, national oversight?
So there are a lot of people working on this. I've had the great pleasure to talk to many of the conference organizers, and the convening is the first thing that happens. There are very few who want to be the standards body. Most people say ultimately we need legislation. Until then, we need education. So, how do we educate the people designing and making products and services that are digital in nature? I think that there are good guidelines, and we're starting to see that. We're seeing health tech guidelines and checklists, but nobody has to adhere to a checklist. So again, it kind of goes back to there. Regulation is coming, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I know you do a lot of work with federal agencies. I They've gotten significantly better, even just the 5 years I've been in healthcare and creating the digital leg of the FDA. And it's not for lack of trying. They're trying their best to keep pace. It's just that everything moves so dang fast.
Mhm.
It's hard. It's hard. They have a tough job as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I think, yeah, we do a lot of work with the Department of Education and NASA, Homeland Security, a lot of people working on really big, messy problems where emerging technologies are part of the answer. Like right now, we're working with DHS and NASA on the detection of opioids in the international mail system. So, what are the technologies that could help us do that? Um, and I think it is exciting, and people don't always realize that there are people in government who are doing this really meaningful work across many agencies. I personally find it really exciting that our government does do this. I think you've all seen HHS and Kidney X, which is also an incredible program, sort of a partnership with the nonprofit side. So, it is happening, and it is deep and meaningful work, and probably I would actually argue that in these types of programs coming out of federal agencies, they must have to think a little bit more about the unintended consequences than a private sector company would right now. Um, doesn't mean it's always perfect, but I mean, I'm really excited for the future.
I am too. I feel good about where we're at. And to bring it back to voice tech, I guess where do you see it going in terms of healthcare? Because you've talked about having these controlled platforms that are doing really specific tasks. Do you think we move towards a direction where it's much more like the consumer side of
Oh, well,
things?
yeah, I mean, eventually, if it really is like the mouse or the touch screen of the future, it will be a great way to interact with a lot of different applications where it makes sense to use your voice. There's somewhere it won't make sense, like things you don't feel comfortable saying out loud, or in especially if you're in public. But one of the team members here at Luminary Labs said that um, every morning she basically uses a voice device to like do all the things that I would use a laptop for, and I felt really old when she said that. She's like, why would you do that? Like, you could just ask a device while you're actually getting ready versus like get ready and then look at the weather. Run to your laptop and look at your weather. And I was like, she's right. It is. And I think, if you're, probably under 30, like voice is just a very familiar interface. So I think all things consumer, whether it's health or finance, like people will be more comfortable doing that. I think the closed environment stuff will continue to lead right now. HIPAA compliance will lead to, more applications that are kind of in between. But keep your eye on the hospitals, again, like Boston Children's. Um, they host or co-host the Voice.Health event, which will be taking place at the health conference later this fall in Las Vegas. That's a really good one. They have a nice cross section of all the different opportunity areas. Last year at their event, I was blown away by the ability to stretch voice into things such as creating a voice bank so that you could give a human a voice back after they had lost the ability to speak. And so, we saw this video of somebody who was like in a wheelchair, couldn't speak, had a dog, and was able to like call her dog and give the dog a treat. Right? Like it was just, it was such a great example of technology giving somebody like humanity or a manifestation of humanity that they had lost, right? Um, and to be able to have that voice bank. The vocal biomarkers are kind of interesting, right? Like that's a space where I think, in particular, mood is one of the things that most people are looking at. Maybe Parkinson's or other, age-related conditions. Over time, there are hypotheses that we'll be able to infer other things about voice. As well as I think Deloitte has this application, this pilot they did in Australia, where instead of having like the nurse's call button, they kind of like outfit an Alexa Echo, and you don't push a button, you just ask for what you want. So think about that. Today you push a button. Sometimes you say what you need. Sometimes somebody comes and you tell them what you need, but you can actually just like say into the device what you need, and then it just shows up. And then on the back end, they can see how long it took them to respond.
That's awesome. Yeah, one of the most exciting uses of voice tech for me is just general companionship. I mean, if you've seen the movie Her, it can get really weird really quick, I think. But it's so with the everyone having a smartphone and social and all the things that have come about in the last 10 years, I think as a society we've lost the community that we so much of that has been displaced with
Yeah.
technology. And if you could just talk to someone and have it talk back, that seems pretty interesting. And I know therapy is a big thing. I don't personally use a therapist at this point, but I know just talking out your problems and talking through what's going on in your life seems to have a lot of benefit for a lot of people.
Absolutely. I mean, the irony of technology and internet in particular is it was supposed to bring us closer, and in many ways, we've socially withdrawn. Right, loneliness um, is on the rise, and there are countries that have like chief loneliness officers now, or ministers, I think. So it is interesting. I don't think it's ever intended to be a replacement. Um,
I
I
hope not.
hope not as well. I mean,
Humans are neat.
I like humans a lot. I like technology, but I like humans more. But we have to remind ourselves that we're building technology for us, not to replace us, right? Like we're the ones doing the building, and so we get to choose.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered a lot. Is there anything that jumps out that maybe we didn't hit that you want to highlight?
I think this has been a wonderful chat. I thank you so very much for having me back, and uh, hope to see everybody at Health later this fall in Voice.Health. I think that's a great place to catch up. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
or at any other conference until then.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to your social sites and luminarylabs.com. Sarah, I just want to thank you for you're so far ahead of where most people are thinking, and just the commentary you put on your social channels is really thought provoking for me personally. And then at Luminary Labs, the things you're thinking about really challenge my way of thinking, because oftentimes you're a couple steps ahead of where I'm even at.
Well, you can thank a very large team of people who are working on a broad cross section of problems here at Luminary Labs for that. If you are interested in stretching your brain across like different areas and spaces, we do publish the lab report every Thursday, and you can sign up on the Luminary Labs website. One thing that's new this year is once a month we issue a problem spotlight, and it is something that is usually a little bit ahead of the curve because it's something that we've been asked to work on. So we share our thinking on that early. So if that interests you, glad to share that link as well.
All right, that's fantastic. Well, thanks so much for sharing your perspective. It's super interesting, and I'm hoping we can get back for a third time sometime soon to see how it all plays out, because I'm sure it won't take too long to really solidify.
Great, we'll make it a trilogy.